Once again, we can really see the buildings on the opposite side with their Dutch, Flemish and gabled architecture. And notice those chimneys up there, something that I'm sure Mary Poppins would die for. You don't see that kind of architecture too much around this area. And there's somebody looking down at us. You see the face of that man there. There's so many interesting things to see, which in a normal working day you might pass by and not even notice. Now, many of these buildings, which were built for shipping offices, like Dock Chambers, where Butte Town History and Arts is now located, and these buildings opposite us were actually owned by Greek shipping magnate families. At the far end, the magnificent Pasco house with a great deal of ornamentation. Now, all the local cleaners, our mothers and grandmothers who cleaned these offices in the heyday, all of the local ones will tell you that that building is haunted. And perhaps it's the reason that there's so few tenants in there to this day. But they all talk about squeaking floors and lights that go on and off in that particular building. Now, if you look over to the left, you can see where the West Butte dock used to be. It was there that the Norwegian church once stood, and it's where Roald Dahl was actually baptized, as many of the Norwegian seamen sailed into Cardiff docks to bring timber into South Wales to support the mining community by taking timber up to the valleys to prop up the mine pits. Now I come to the saddest part of this journey around Tiger Bay and the docks, because I would love to take you to the Tiger Bay that I grew up in. But sadly, all of it has been demolished and been replaced by rather lackluster council estate architecture, and there isn't anything left of Tiger Bay as I knew it for you to see.
Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay, it's not very far from the docks. When you get to Loudon Square, turn to the right and you're not far from there. Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay, it's just like a fancy dress ball. And those that can't say that they've been down the bay, well, they haven't seen Cardiff at all.
Here we can see the last remaining facade of Butte Street, which we've been so painfully deprived of in the past, which leads us down to West Butte Street into Mount Stewart Square, which fortunately is still there for us to see. So that's where we're going to go now, so we can see Mount Stewart Square. So follow me now, let's go.
And those that can't say that they've been down the bay, well, they haven't seen Cardiff at all.
Now, this is the Butte Dock Hotel and is an extension of what was the Baltimore on the other side. The cottage-like structure, which this pub is made out of, is typical of the many cottage-like buildings throughout Tiger Bay and the docks. And in fact, cottage-like structures stretched all the way up the rest of West Butte Street, beyond the National Westminster Bank, which we see here, an exact replica of the facade we saw on Butte Street. On the opposite side is the Conrick Buildings, built in 1913 and which was once a post office exchange. But this is a fantastic building designed by Henry Budgeon, and if you don't look up, you won't see the various mythological beasts and sea creatures hiding in the nooks and crannies of this grand structure. They started to demolish Tiger Bay in the 60s and 70s, and they came down into Mount Stewart Square with the intention of demolishing St. Stephen's, which by that time had already been deconsecrated. And they came to inspect it and noticed the 5 stained glass windows on the north face. However, once they cleaned the grime off to see what was beneath the soot of a century of time, they discovered 2 of these stained glass windows were actually made in the William Morris Studios in Holland Park in London, and that gave this building a listed status, and that's the reason we still see it today. And of course now it is the Point, which is a theatre space and design centre. Now we should go into Mount Stewart Square to see the other interesting buildings that are there. So follow me this way into Mount Stewart Square. Now here in front of us is Cambrian Buildings, another Henry Budgeon masterpiece, but it's much older than Conrick Buildings around the corner, being built around 1911. Right next to it is the magnificent Bainon Building, with lots of ornate architectural features screaming out for explanation. If you look up, you'll see cherubs or babies, or perhaps they're images of the Marquis and one of his relatives in nappies or something. There's all sorts of interesting bas-relief, especially maritime bas-relief with galleons and boats and what have you on the first floor. And next to Bainon House are the typical Georgian homes you'd see throughout the whole of Mount Stewart Square before the demolition, where local families lived until the 1960s. So let's go on into Mount Stewart Square now and see the rest of the square. Now here we are at the actual entrance to the Cardiff Coal Exchange. This was a very important building. It replaced one of the Marquis's parks that was in the centre of this square, and it was built in the 1880s, long after the Marquis had moved into Cardiff Castle. It was important because this is where the price of coal was determined for the whole world. Businessmen would go up these steps, Victorian ones in particular, right through these doors onto a huge wooden floor which still exists there with large, beautifully ornate wooden balconies, and big decisions were made. You know, in fact, the first £1 million cheque ever signed in the world was signed right here in Mount Stewart Square. So we were really Britain's second city at the turn of the century, when you have the largest bank outside London around the corner. It has ornate features around the entrance, and you can see lots of dragons, which are the typical emblem of Wales. But these dragons are not Welsh dragons at all. All of these dragons are Russian dragons, Baltic dragons. We had an international connection, because not only were Baltic dragons here, but we have African lions representing our Egyptian or port-side connection with the world. And if we look up the rest of Mount Stewart Square area, we can see the Dowlais Arcade. Now, when I was growing up, the Dowlais Arcade had cobbled stones in it, and it was a lane leading into the Dowlais pub, which is still there, in fact, as you'll see when you look down the lane. And it was lanes like these, dotted throughout Tiger Bay and the docks, that the Breton onion sellers used to come and stay in. And there we would go to see them. And of course, from those lanes, they would load their bicycles with onions and go all over the city of Cardiff selling their onions. Let's go down and see Perch Buildings, which is named after William Perch, who was a colliery owner in the valleys. And obviously, if you were a colliery owner, you had a great deal of wealth, and it was easy to have buildings named after you. And this is a lovely ornate structure if you take the time to look at it. Now, this is Baltic House. This is another Henry Budgeon masterpiece. It was built in 1915 and replaced 3 Georgian houses and a chapel. And as you can see, it's got amazing maritime bas-relief on its structure as well. And this also is the headquarters of Cardiff Bay Development Corporation. So they have quite a grand building for their headquarters. Of course, on the opposite side, we see the magnificent southern facade of the Coal Exchange building. This is not the main entrance, but it looks like it should be. It's such a grand facade on the south side. This building was meant to be Wales's Parliament 20 years ago, but nevertheless, it is a grand structure that deserves to be preserved. Now, before we leave Mount Stewart Square, we can see Aberdare House standing like an oasis between the spaces where the buildings were demolished in the 60s and 70s. Aberdare House was built in 1920, or approximately at that time, and Next to this open parking lot, we can see the site where once stood the Casa Blanca, a famous nightclub known around the world. But many years before, when it was built in 1858, it was one of the Welsh-speaking churches that was located in the Tiger Bay and Dockland area. One of 4, in fact. Now, we shall go out of Mount Stewart Square and make our way down to the seafront and come towards the end of our walk.